Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Culturally Competent Conversations for Equity and Belongingness Summit. We are on our final day, and this is our final panel discussion for this summit. Of course, there will be other panel discussions in the future, but for this summit, this is the final panel discussion. And our theme for today is, what is it going to take for us to build a culturally competent society for the future? Our day one, we talked about corporate. Yesterday, we talked about sort of the government, governance, civics, and the institutions. Today, let's focus on the people and the human behavior and what it is going to take for all of us as humans to come together as humanity. And so with that being said, it is my absolute honor to introduce our panelists for today. I'm going to read their names real quick, and then I'm going to read their bios. And just like with the other two panels, our panelists are then going to get a little bit of time to talk for us to learn about them in their own words before we jump into the questions. So with absolute pleasure and honor, I'm thrilled to bring to you Pascale Edouard, MPH, Joseph T. Hare, who did an amazing talk yesterday, and Pascale's doing a talk later today. Kobena-Marcus J, who did an amazing talk on Wednesday on day one. Priscilla Green, who also did her talk on day one, and Dr. Nicole Carter, who is going to be blowing our minds away with a talk later today. So all of these panelists have their individual solo sessions, so that's great. A little bit about them and their official bios. Let's start with Pascale. Pascale D. Edouard is a passionate, people-oriented public health enthusiast with an interest in advancing public health practice and addressing health disparities and inequities. Pascale earned her Master of Public Health degree from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University's Institute of Public Health in 2012. She is currently a Doctor of Public Health student at the University of South Florida's College of Public Health. Ms. Edouard is currently employed as the Healthcare Services Program Manager for a local county government. She was previously employed with the Florida Department of Health for a combined 6 years, where she served as the Health Equity Coordinator. Pascale is a governing counselor at the American Public Health Association's Public Health Education and Health Promotion section, president of Manatee Bridging the Gap Incorporated, and vice chair of Gulf Coast South Area Health Education Centers. To bring light to underlying issues associated with health inequality and inequities, and to encourage collaborative engagement among public health professionals and community members, Pascale launched People of Color Health Matters, or POC Health Matters, in August of 2017. The mission of POC Health Matters is to reimagine, realize, and actualize health equity among communities of color. That was awesome. Our next panelist, Joseph Hare, some of you may have heard about him yesterday, but for those who are just joining us, Joseph Hare is the founder, president, and senior consultant at Hare Holdings LLC, an operations and organizational development expert, independent holistic ministerial evangelist, and seasoned manager with over 25 years of leadership. Joseph Hare has made advancing the vital needs of organizations and individuals his vocation and avocation. Motivated by an inner spirit, his personal mantra is, "The sovereignty of man is found in his self-denying service to his fellow man." Whether working alone or as a part of a high-performance team, Joseph has added to the advancement of people, processes, and profit for not-for-profit and for-profit organizations with as few as 60 employees to as many as 340,000 across varied industries. As a man of many talents and areas of expertise, Joseph has started 3 companies, earned 4 advanced degrees, achieved international scholastic recognition, provides ministerial support for churches across 4 states, advocates for at-risk people of all demographics, and single-handedly raised 2 sons. Joseph balances his busy professional life with varied hobbies and social interests, including playing tennis, basketball, air hockey, reading, life coaching, facilitating, business networking, leading group panel discussions, teaching Bible classes, fine dining, and theater outings with friends and families. Joseph is a passionate communicator and public speaker who believes the most sublime way to show one's appreciation for knowledge manifests in sharing it with the open-hearted. Whew. We have an amazing list of panelists today, if you guys can't tell. Next, I want to talk about Dr. Nicole Carter, who is the founder and creator of the Sis brand. Dr. Nicole Carter, PhD, is the CEO and curator of the Sis brand, a creative multi-industry company designed to meet the needs of women, particularly women of color, in the areas of writing, wellness, and workspace design. In addition, she is also the director of the Wright State University Women's Center. She also teaches in various fields, including student affairs, the Student Affairs and Higher Education program, and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. Her foci include the intersectional experiences of women in university settings, persistence and retention of women in higher education, and the creation of counter spaces for women students of color and women students in STEM. She received her PhD from Eastern Michigan University. And on a personal note, Dr. Nicole Carter has been one of my dearest friends for over 25 years now. So I am so thrilled she agreed to do this summit. Just personal note right there. Our next panelist is Priscilla Green. Priscilla Green is an online executive assistant working with 6- and 7-figure women business owners and entrepreneurs. She is the founder and CEO of Freedom to Focus Business Support. She helps CEOs with other CEOs with their business systems and processes to allow them to experience the freedom to focus on their revenue-generating business activities and in fully serving their clients. With a background in customer service and personal assistance, Priscilla provides high-touch services to high-achieving women and their clients so they can achieve this work-life balance that seems to be a unicorn. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Kobena-Marcus J who is the Diversity and Inclusion Advisor at Kohl's Corporate. Kobena-Marcus J is a native of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He holds a BA in Secondary Education and History from Lake Forest College and earned a Master of Education in Cultural Foundations of Education from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Kobena has held numerous positions in numerous organizations over the past decade, most notably as the National Director for Diversity Recruitment. And prior to his current role was the diversity recruiter for the city of Milwaukee. In this newly created position, Kobena was able to not only increase the diversity of the applicant pool for jobs at the city, but also helped users in the helped usher in the new ERGs and helped to develop a citywide ERG strategy. Kobena is also passionate about diversity and inclusion. His ultimate goal is to be a chief diversity officer or a vice president of diversity and inclusion of a corporation, nonprofit organization, or a higher education institution. Having come from a multi-ethnic, multicultural environment and having the opportunity to travel to 10 countries in one semester with college students from around the world has given him a unique perspective that very few others in the world have. He has studied D&I best practices for the past 6 years and continues to gain new information from leaders around the country. He believes that one's ability to grow is dependent on their ability, always be learning. And so that is the bios for our panelists. As you can tell, we have a powerhouse panel today, and this is going to be a very exciting panel. So let's, before we jump into the questions, I want to give our viewers a little bit of a better understanding of you beyond your bios. So I'm gonna, call you out by name, but what what I'd like you to do is take about 60 seconds and let us know what drives, all of you are so highly accomplished in your own ways. What drives you to do what you do and to keep going? Let's start with, I'm going to be super biased here. Let's start with Dr. Nicole Carter.
Bias would have been letting me go last, actually. I can think about
that's built in.
The red sword, right?
So I would say what drives me, so first of all, let me just say I'm a native of Detroit, Michigan, and that is part of everything that I do. And so I know, everything that I do reminds me of, I'm always reminded of the things that happens living in the city, because now I stay in Ohio, in a suburb of Ohio. And it's vastly different, but I see similarities within the students that I work with. And what drives me is our inability to focus on the intersections of identity. We often focus on things in silos. And we also don't really focus on people being well either. We're so I guess, interested in creating change within, so for example, within the field that I'm in, but we don't understand that change means meeting people where they are, being okay with not being okay, and putting forth some intentions to be okay, right? Paying attention to those who are not well and asking questions about that. So that's part of what drives me. But really that, and I'm gonna be real biased here, really that the Black women, the young Black women that I work with, they are not, we see them as those who always get degrees and things like that, but they are struggling with other personal issues that we are not attentive to. And so that is what drives me, because I was that young Black woman who was also struggling, and I don't feel like it's something they have to do. So.
Kobena-Marcus, what drives you?
Right. So first, before I get into that, I just want to say how much of an honor it is to be on this panel with all these critically acclaimed professionals in all their own fields. It's a great thing, and I start off with that because that's part of what drives me. What drives me is being amongst such talented people as those on this panel, to be able to just kind of fulfill who I am. As a mixed kid growing up, my piece earlier this week was the adaptive journey of a confused kid, and being able to learn who I am. Shout out to those from Detroit, my line brother. I happen to be a member of the oldest and the coldest fraternity in the world, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and my LB is from Detroit. So shout out to Detroit. There you go. I see you. And so just being a product of a interracial marriage, having a lesbian sister who's been married for with her wife for 30 years, having 3 older sisters and a brother, and being the youngest, I didn't really have a choice but to be in this space. I was forced into having an open mind and thinking about diversity and culture and what that all means at a very early age. I had no assigned identity, so to speak, because I didn't fit into a box. I blew the box up, and society is starting to blow the box up a little bit more, or trying to. And there are certain forces that are trying to keep that box closed. And so my personal mission is to help others find their truest self and their truest passion. And in order for us to do that, we need to blow the box up.
Absolutely. Pascale, what about you? What drives you?
Yeah, I can appreciate a lot of what Dr. Carter and Kobena said, to be completely transparent. But what drives me is, in the simple term, is my Blackness. I'm Black, but I'm also Haitian. And for the longest, growing up in Miami, the Haitian immigrant parents, it was always difficult navigating being both Black and Haitian, and figuring out who I am in between those two spaces. However, growing up, just seeing the plight among the Haitian community as well as the Black community. I attended a predominantly Black high school by choice, Miami Northwestern in Miami, and just seeing the lived experiences of Black people is just really, it really from an early age, just like, I told my mother at 9, I was just like, I want to be able to advocate on behalf of Black people. We so-called are voiceless, but we actually do have a voice. And so I think, entering and being part of the table when it comes to advocating on behalf of Black people in America and our well-being, especially when it comes to like health disparities and how the system, this racist system, negatively impacts our well-being, is truly what drives me and keeps me waking up and going on day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. Priscilla, what drives you?
Yes, hi. I am coming from just north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And as a Filipino American, I grew up in small town USA with such a small percentage of diversity. We were known in the community because we looked different. We had different traditions. And now I am married to a Black man and have biracial children, and we are still in the same community. And so now it has become advocating for ourselves to advocating for our children, and finding that acceptance and common ground with people in the community. Thank goodness our community is growing and we have people moving in from all over the country, and there's a lot more acceptance and open-mindedness for all different cultures, all different races, ethnicities. And so I am also working with women. I have made that decision to work with women and empowering more women in the work that I do, and just creating an atmosphere in my life and hopefully influencing some others to live a life where you're accepting and open to everyone, no matter their background. So that is what drives me.
Absolutely. And last but not least, Joseph, what drives you to do everything?
Yeah, thank you, AJ. And I have to say, to just answer the question directly, it's my upbringing. I was one of 14 children. My dad didn't necessarily contribute the way he could have, and my mom had a major battle with raising 14 children as a stay-home mom without employment. So we've met so many variations of complication, and then I lived in a community that didn't always appreciate their neighbor. And with that kind of environment as a place where I grew from, it didn't take long to understand that survival was going to be a very diverse effort. And then it became a very personal effort where I found myself not being able to tap into other people very readily to get what I needed. I had to look within. And so the creative element of survival, I began to understand just how broad and how complex that could be as a child. And so when I got into ministry very early, I think I was about 20 years old when God called me to ministry. That was the first space that I began to experience reaching into other people's lives instead of just my own. And I found that that's a very interesting challenge because so many individuals really don't know how to identify themselves. And so moving into a lot of different cultures and individuals of different economic capacities, different educational capacities, different tolerance capacities, different viewpoints, capacities of their local environment and the world environment, I found that we're really living in a very complex world. And so it pushed me to begin to find creative ways based upon the calling I had in ministry, which is now 33 years strong. I didn't take it a light calling to actually help people find healthy pathways to achieve what they really indeed want to do in their life without doing it at the expense of others. And it really caused me to become very vibrant in trying to look at creative ways to help one without hurting another. And in an economic society like we have in America, that's not always easy. So whether if it's in the prison system or working with elderly or working with individuals who are single parents or individuals who are economically challenged, all the different variations, people who are very financially successful, there's something continuous that I noticed among people that just kept me looking for new ways to make a difference. And that is that people really do want to do something good. They really do. It's just, how can they do it without bringing bad on someone else? And that's where my role of creating and innovating new ideas and being a thought provocateur, I think that it really keeps me moving into the pathway that I'm going, and always looking for new ways to tap into outside sources so I can improve myself and give to others. And that's basically what keeps me moving.
Wow. Okay. All right. So I hope that gives our viewers, a good idea of what, what drives all of you. And I really wanted to ask this question, and I asked all the panelists on all 3 days these questions, because I feel like, my experience being a part of these conferences, we don't get to hear the human side of what motivates the panelists. It's really just about the topic, and then they leave and we're left with, yeah, okay, but who is that person? What is their story to be able to say what they did? So that's why, with that in mind, I've been asking everybody, what drives you? What drives you? Tell us about yourself. So I hope that was helpful. I know it was helpful for me. I feel like I know all of you so much better now, just based on what you said. So let's jump right into the questions. Continuing the trend of the previous 2 panels again, let's level set first. So I'm going to, again, call out names. And the question is, what does cultural competence in society mean to you? Let's start with Pascale.
I have a couple of things in mind when it comes to what cultural competency in society looks like to me. I think it's the importance of recognizing our individual biases. White, black, purple, blue, we all have individual implicit biases. And I think we need to start with ourselves first in order to move the needle when it comes to cultural competency. And also, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, and I'm thinking about like within the professional workspace. And a lot of what I'm seeing is that we may have a minority at the table. Sorry, my dogs are in the background if you hear them. A lot of times we have minorities at the table as quote unquote representatives of a organization or corporation, but are we truly listening to what they have to bring and say and contribute to the organization? So I think in order to move in a more culturally to a space where we're a more culturally competent society, we actually have to be transparent and have those honest and hard conversations within those organizations in order to meet the needs of people of diverse backgrounds. And then also, the last thing I want to say is the fact, like when we're thinking about the services that we provide to communities of color, actually taking into consideration how they're receiving those services, whether or not, they felt like their needs were met in a culturally competent way, I think is also important when we think about moving into a culturally competent society.
Joseph, what does cultural competence mean to you?
Well, what it means to me is successfully separating social culture from one's individual character, and subjectively understanding that which is truly culture. Sometimes we identify a person's culture, but then we're really beginning to speak about their character. And culture to me is a lot larger than the individual, and character makes it very personal. And so I think culture in society really can be more understood when we stop trying to take a person's character and making it an attribute of a social culture. And if we can really understand culture, it allows more individuals to feel less individually threatened or attacked or identified. Whereas when we're really understanding culture, It allows everyone to feel a little more comfortable with saying, oh, we are the one who's being looked at, not just me as an individual. And that, I think, is one good way of building our competency, and then understanding why it's important, because my character sometimes may not have positive traits, but as a member of a culture, I can be a very positive contributor. And so if you just focus on my character, then oftentimes it makes me feel like you just don't want me to be a part, and it becomes very personal. But if we speak and address each other with social competency as a culture, it allows us to be a lot more welcoming, a lot less directly pointed, unless I'm asking for individual assistance, but as a cultural group. I'd rather that the traits that I share with my community that I identify with be the focus, and not so much me as an individual person, unless that's what the goal is. So social competency, as far as culturally speaking, doesn't directly speak to a person's character, but the unique shared traits of a particular community.
Absolutely. Yeah. Bob, what are your thoughts on what does a culturally competent society mean to you?
So, there's a movie that I enjoy. I like some semi-cheesy old kung fu and karate movies. And there was one particular movie that a young man was being trained, and the master was, as he was talking to him, he was filling this young man's cup with tea. And he was talking, and then the young man starts rambling off all these different fighting styles. Am I going to learn dragon style and this style and that style? And he would list it off, this 5-minute long list. And the whole time, the master is pouring the cup, tea in the cup. The cup gets full and starts to pour over, and the hot tea starts to spill over onto his hand. And the young man says, "It's hot. It's full. It's full. It's full." And so the master says, exactly. So how can I fill a cup that's already full? Empty your cup. And from a cultural competence standpoint, society has to be open and has to empty out what they think they know about other people and about other cultures, and needs to be open to asking and learning and listening, to Pascale's point. They have to be able to listen to what the feedback they're getting, and listen to the stories of other cultures, so that they can understand in an authentic way, as opposed to holding on to their preconceived notions and their biases, and based off of their lived experiences or the lived experiences of others that they heard about these different communities. So again, I think people have to look internally also, as was previously stated, make sure that their cup is not full, and be open to somebody else pouring into them.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a question in the comments, but we will come back to that. Let's finish our question for this one first. Priscilla, what does cultural competence in society, if I can, talk today, mean to you?
Yeah, so I think for me, my standpoint is, learning about all the differences that come from everybody around the world, in our country, and learning about those differences and accepting those differences, and having a vested interest, a personal interest in wanting to learn about others. I personally love learning about other people, their cultures, their upbringings, just learning about people and who they are, and what they're about, and like the others have said, and not always taking into account what society, any stereotypes and any preconceived notions that you have about others, and really celebrating who they are and their backgrounds, and weaving that into your own life, and saying, this might not be how I do things or how my family does things, but we're learning about others, and we are accepting others for who they are. and really spreading that awareness to others that it's not some small sphere of where you're living and how you're living your life can be so much more whenever you're accepting everyone for who they are and learning more and just really creating this open-mindedness around society as a whole. So.
Yeah, definitely. And now, last but not least, Dr. Nicole Carter. I'm going to say that every time. Dr. Nicole Carter, what does cultural competence in society mean to you?
So I do believe that cultural competence, like others have stated, means that we are attentive to differences, but I also believe that it is understanding that those differences are a means of connecting, and recognizing that there's a need to connect across those differences. Also, like, I'm a proponent of always bringing up intersectionality. When I'm on campus, one of the things that students always say, and actually, in fact, a student painted like this picture that said, ask me about intersectionality, Dr. Professor Carter. Like, it's like a joke that I always bring it up or something. But for me, it's understanding that we are complex beings with a multiplicity of experiences. And those things make us human. It doesn't take away from who we are. And then I would say that cultural competency also means seeing each other. So like actually seeing you for who you are, not ignoring, not silencing, but seeing each other. And it's, so again, within the spaces that I work, when students and when really staff and faculty talk about the problems that they are facing, issues with inequity on campus, things like that, a lot of administrators see those things as their perception. Like, this is your perception. But what is the true reality? And I for me, a culturally competent society understands that that perception that you think they have is their reality. Like, they are going through these things every single day. So this is part of their experience. And so it's moving beyond just like,
Absolutely. Before we move on to the next question, there was a comment about this, that this is for Joseph and anyone else on the panel to comment. But Joseph, this was about what you said earlier about the difference between the character and the culture. And the comment is, however, the character of the leader of a group decides the culture of that group. And so I just wanted to give you a minute to comment on that based on what you said earlier.
I think that the way that person is using the word character might be a little different than the way that I was using character. Because if they're talking about a leader, then the way a person acts or presents themselves in leadership may have influences of their personal character upon what they do. But that doesn't mean that what they're doing is a pure reflection of their character. So it would have to be, well, then what exactly is this person trying to address when they're trying to use a person's leadership behavior and then attaching it to their character? Because a person's character takes direct exploration. You can't just understand it from the surface. So a character is a result of someone having to explore that person and then learning what it is in that person that moves and motivates what they do. We're talking about a motive base. So if we're trying to tell a person, you led this way because of your character, then that's a very irresponsible assessment. because that person couldn't know this individual's character deep enough, well enough, or thorough enough to be able to rightly say this action was provoked by this character. So I would have to get a much better understanding on how a person could easily identify a leadership trait or style and make it subject to a person's character. So I'd have to get more data on that to better understand how that person is coming from with that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the next question. This one is for Dr. Nicole, Pascale, and Priscilla, our wonderful panelists who identify as women on this panel. There's a vast amount of research about how women of color as a group, especially Black women, are outpacing men on education, on degrees, and educational attainment. But we also know that there is a severe scarcity of women of color in leadership roles. Again, especially Black women in leadership roles. We also know, on top of that, that COVID has highlighted some glaring problems for women or as caregivers, especially if they're single parents, faced with balancing childcare, homeschooling work, mental health, and all of that. And on top of that, most of this doesn't even include those who are not cisgender women. Trans women are often excluded from any of these kind of groups. So of course, there's been a loud call for change and support, but so far there's nothing, there doesn't seem to be any kind of like a semblance of a sustainable solution to how do we address all of this? So here's my loaded question for you. Do you have any ideas, ladies, on how we can go about building an actually sustainable system of support and equity for our sisters? And let's start with Dr. Nicole.
Sorry, I was like,
do you want to take a minute and like grab some water? We'll start with Priscilla.
Or with someone else, yes.
Priscilla, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think that bringing in very strong, knowledgeable people that have the experience and even from the background of having experiences as experiencing those shortfalls and all those struggles, and bringing together a group of people that have those experiences and can come up with a strategic plan. And one where you have goals that are set up and you're coming up with the actual steps to reach those goals and make sure that you are taking into consideration the input from the people that are experiencing these shortfalls. We can't just assume that we're going to come up with a plan and we haven't been through that ourselves. We don't have that experience, and how can we help them if we don't know what that experience has been like? So let's bring in people that know from the core what that's like, what has been needed in the past, how can we truly help the people that need the help and include them, and come up with a feasible plan where you really are going to make those changes that need to be made.
Absolutely. Pascale, what about you? Do you have any ideas of how we can go about building actually sustainable systems of support and equity for women?
I echo a lot of what Priscilla just said. Can you hear me? No? Okay, perfect. Yeah, I echo a lot of what Priscilla just said. But I also think, can you hear me better now? No? But I also think too, and I'm thinking about a recent event that happened with me yesterday, which was like a missed opportunity, where I was meeting with one of our local county commissioners, and he has like this strategic plan focused on finances, healthcare, and healthcare, law enforcement, and education within the Black community in the county that I live in. And he identified the leaders for each of those 4 categories, and they were all Black men, right? And in my mind, I'm like, these 4 areas impact and affect Black women as well. So where are the women in this and everything? So I think one of the things I would say is just speaking up, because it was, my missed opportunity yesterday to speak up and just be like, hey, these 4 areas negatively impact Black women too. So I think it's important for us when we're at the table to speak up about, the importance of having Black women in leadership roles to drive those strategies or those issues that impact all of us. I think is one way to start having more Black women at the table or in leadership roles.
Absolutely. Dr. Nicole, what are your thoughts on how we can, or ideas on how we can build these sustainable systems of support?
So 2 things. So I do agree with Pascale and Priscilla in that we have to have a seat at the table if we're going to build anything. And that includes cisgender and trans women as well. And when that seat is not available, we have to kind of take a seat and recognize that, yes, there's a risk in doing that. But our ancestors risked everything that they had for us to be in these spaces in the first place. So another thing, though, if we're talking about building something, I feel like we talk about it a lot, but we're building on top of a framework or a foundation that's faulty and that wasn't meant for us to be there in the first place. So I'm always going to use my experience, right, as like part of my explanation. So again, working in higher education, educational institutions like that were not meant for us unless you go to one specifically created for a particular student body of color, right? But like the institution that I'm in, that space wasn't created for me to be there. And so now the majority of the students there are women. So women make up 53% of really pretty much any educational institution of higher education, unless again it's specifically like for men or something like that, right? And then women of color are increasingly part of that demographic. But we're continuously partaking in an institution that had they didn't want us there in the first place. So before we can build something, we need to understand that history. And then we also need to take some steps to really, I'll just call it decolonize, right, those institutions and hold folks accountable for maintaining institutions that are based in white supremacy. And I think that's a little bit more difficult of a conversation to have. And it might be easier for us to like have a seat at the table. But what if we just throw the table over and bring in our own table, right? And own seat? I don't know. But it's complex for me. So
absolutely. It is definitely a very complex, multifaceted, nuanced issue overall, which is why I included it as a question for this panel, because this is something that I know I've had individual conversations with all 3 of you in the past about this, and we've had these kind of thoughts that come up in the course of our conversation. So I wanted to kind of bring our collective thoughts together in this panel to say, okay, what do we do? Because these are things that we're all thinking about individually. So when we put our heads together, what comes up? And for me, it's incredible to see that even though the individual stories, as Priscilla said, are going to be different, and we are going to We have to listen to those lived experiences. And as Pascale said, we have to speak up. And as Dr. Nicole Carter said, if there is no seat, then we bring our own seat, or let's flip that table over and bring our own table. All of these are the same thoughts I hear over and over and over again from the women with the lived experiences. And I think, at the bottom line is that, Dr. Nicole made a very good point, is that part of the reason this is not working is because these spaces were never meant for us. So we really, really need to think about that. And we really need to think about, okay, how do we first restructure the space, fix the cracks in the foundation, and then build up on it. So that was great. Let's flip this question to the men on the panel, in the sense that oftentimes these movements towards equity, parity, and inclusion focus on those who identify as women. Occasionally, you see some memes or thoughts here and there about Black men. Definitely not too much on Asian men or anything, else of that nature, unless it's being politicized, of course. And men from other marginalized groups are still being missed from these conversations. And again, even here, most often, trans men are excluded from all of these. So how can we as a society do better about understanding the intersectionalities and unique needs of those who identify as men, especially men of color? Because there's a ton of layers again, but people are presented as these like flat two-dimensional, men's needs are presented as these flat two-dimensional things, and that can't be true. And when we're talking about equity and inclusion, it is incredibly important for us to look at the needs of all genders, not just, for parity. And granted, men do have more power now, but still, what are these unique needs, and how do we go about better understanding the intersectionalities of men? Let's start with Kobena-Marcus.
Right, this is a deep question because it has so many facets to it. As a Black man, but also as a mixed ethnic man, I've always kind of looked at things from multiple different perspectives. Also grew up in a Puerto Rican neighborhood, growing up as a mixed kid with a Black father, a white mother. I looked Puerto Rican, so for a long time I was Marco, and grew out the tail in the back and had the ear piercings and everything. Only thing I really knew about the culture was how to say some bad words. But that's what I used to be able to move throughout life. And when you think about intersectionality, and you think about, especially in the diversity and inclusion space, you think about cultures, and you think about, people a lot of times have the question, they have the questions between when do you say Black or African American? And it's two very different things. And growing up in the neighborhood where I grew up in Milwaukee, you have, Puerto Ricans that look Black, that they look like they grew up in Mississippi. You've got, Indian people who may look like they grew up in New Orleans. They may look Creole almost, and so we have to really think about not only the intersectionality, but the dynamic, how dynamic these different marginalized groups are. And one fix isn't going to fix it for all of them. And we also similarly have to think about there are some common experiences amongst people of color. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin right now. If you've been watching the news, Kenosha is 30 minutes away from Milwaukee. I was in Kenosha on Sunday when the an hour before Jacob Blake was shot. And, there you talk about, the intersectionality. You've got Black people, Latino people, Asian people, and they are all, in this people of color struggle, because those are the people that are being targeted in, by these police officers or by these systemically racist policies that are really tempting at cutting us off at the knees. What I will say is that these communities have struggled for centuries, and we know how to survive. And these communities continue to rely on the intersectionality of people of color to understand a common experience and move in a way that they can not silo the struggle, but bring it together and work together in a more collective effort for change.
Joseph?
Well, yeah, I want to use an example in my effort to address this. I was asked to speak to a group of women who had been victims of domestic abuse. And the individual who invited me said, well, Mr. Hare, if you don't mind me asking, could you try not to look like you're frowning so much? And I said, well, I rarely ever frown. And, as far as just for the sake of frowning. She said, well, but you always look like you're frowning. I said, well, that's just how my face looks naturally when I'm at a rest. And I'm thinking, I wondered, I've tried to understand, how did the look of my face begun to become something that was, she thought, what could be an inhibitor to the depth of information that was going to come out of my mouth. And I thought that really, if we could help women in those backgrounds, experiences, to begin to become comfortable with not just the surface of a person, but in order for them to achieve health for themselves, to begin to explore the deeper aspects of a person and let that be the direction that they go as they attempt to heal from different experiences. Because the way my face looks has nothing to do with what kind of person I am. I could be very, very attractive and peaceful looking and be a very dangerous person. And so when I think about the idea of intersectionalism and transgender, my question will become, if I'm trying to engage sensible access points of opportunity, what does a person's gender have to do with it? Why would we need to focus on an individual's choice for how they identify themselves? And we're talking about just for the sake of inclusiveness. Why would we have to make that something to even focus on in the first place? If we're trying to create ideas for openness and access and opportunity, how can we just create spaces that would be useful and helpful for humans? Because if it's something that's helpful for humans, it's going to make them feel those Maslow hierarchy of needs satisfactions that are not attached to a gender specific identification of themselves. And so even though there is a lot that comes into play, because a lot of what we tend to do, we do out of autonomic responses that have been programmed by neurological pathways that we've put in our own brain that are predisposed to think a certain way about a person. So we do know that there are degrees of complexity to really getting into why I may think a certain way or act a certain way when I'm trying to accept or engage someone. But at the end of the day, if we were trying to really create access points or opportunities or senses of welcome for people as we intersect with each other, we really have to begin to think, am I focusing on that person as a human being, or am I trying to discriminate in the way that I perceive that person and accept that person or engage that person because of the way that I've conditioned my mind about some attribute that that individual possesses? And so that's kind of how I would see if we could form ourselves to being able to focus on what's really most important. My face having certain tendency to look a certain way, is that really more important than getting access to what it is that I have to offer you, and then you amplifying that? And that was where I would hope we could spring from.
Okay. That was, both of you had really, really interesting answers. I think for me, and just not based on my experience and what I've seen in the space, where this question was coming from was more of, one thing that I do want to say is I think it would be fantastic, absolutely ideally fantastic, if people did see each other as whole human beings and treated each other as such. But that's not our reality, you know? And I think the reason that we make a specific point about trans individuals, or a point like, you know, Pascale mentioned about even being Black is not a monolithic concept in itself. There are so many nuances to it, is because based on our history, these were people who weren't treated as wholly human. They were completely excluded, and their voices were, you know, they were rendered invisible. So I think in an effort to re-render them back into visibility and to put them back into spaces that they've always, you know, they were always supposed to belong in, but weren't allowed to belong in. I think, you know, the intentionality of that is where these movements and why they focus on these specific groups, on these specific, you know, groups that have been historically excluded. I think that's where all of that comes in from. So I agree with you that it shouldn't matter. And that's the ideal that I hope we can get to at some point in the future. But, you know, that's, I think, what this panel is about too, is how do we get there? Because right now, these things do matter. Right now, trans lives, you know, aren't, I mean, think about when the Black Lives Matter movement first started, and the response was, well, all lives matter. And it was like, exactly, which is why Black Lives Matter too. You know, you don't need that too at the end. And I think that's the same thing for you know, transgender people, for other marginalized groups, people with visible disabilities, invisible disabilities, you know, people not having to hear things like, oh, you have a disability, but you look so normal. You know, things like that. So I think it would be great if none of those things mattered, but how do we get there to where they don't matter, from a place to where they're being used to exclude, discriminate, harass, and murder people because of these factors? So given that, so thank you for your answers. Do you have any other thoughts on this before we move on to the next question?
I'll just say, I put it in the chat, but for me, like, it is important to see the differences, right? Like, so equity means that you actually see, and you see those differences, you acknowledge them, and you use those differences to work toward change, right? Like, it's not just treating everybody the same. Because that's equality. And equality, we've been talking about equality for years, and it's not working, right? So equity is treating me the way I need to be treated. And so it means seeing me and all the invisible disabilities, my race, my gender, right? Sexuality, whatever it might be, age, and like seeing those and then working together to create that change. So, and then like, Joseph, you brought up the example of talking with survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence. And I feel like one of the reasons perhaps that you were told to change your like facial expression was because it is a trigger. So it could be a trigger, right, for those that you were speaking with. And so it is a process for them to work through that trauma. And to like, so I just had to address that because like, this is what that's what I do every day for my job, is work with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. But I don't know, but that might be one of the reasons.
Yeah, but if I could respond real quick, and I know we're sensitive with time, what I found was from working with so many different complications was we have to make sure we're not enabling a person to feel this victim concept and then be comfortable with keeping that sense of I'm a victim. I think that when we're talking about a person receiving opportunity to grow and then placing a condition on the person who's going to help them to grow to look a certain way in order for them to bring something that will enrich them from their mouth, from their experiences, I think that the reason why I use that as an example, when people experience me, that was their choice because I'm always open. But if they don't want to receive me, I can't control their choice. But if they want to be made better, they can't live within the past experience they've had. They have to be willing to accept the fact that your betterment is going to be driven by your willingness to accept something that will lead you to that betterment, even if you're not used to it. And again, the reason why I use my facial expression because how I look is no different than any other unique trait for any person. And I can look peaceful and be dangerous. So I don't want a person who's a survivor to think that if that person looks peaceful, then you feel comfortable just falling into their arms. But if a person is frowning, that's something you should be afraid of. And they have to get to the point where they're willing to accept that I have to look beyond those surface things if I'm really going to get sustainable change for me. And that so I can be comfortable in a world that is very diverse, even as a person who has this past painful experience. And I've been abused when I was a child. I was abused all until I left home, physically abused. But if I lived in that space of vulnerability, then I would not have been able to understand that when people abuse, they look different ways, they sound different ways, they act different ways. So I have to make sure that I'm using something beyond just that surface, even though we may be able to have something on the surface that may be, as you mentioned, a trigger. So I don't want to I'm not going to belabor the point, but it has been successful when we helped individuals look at something beyond what they think are triggers to really understand what it is that's at the core of what makes them potential victims of that kind of environment. I just thought I would add that.
Absolutely. Any other responses? And I think that, I think this discussion is great. And I think it definitely, just based on, what Dr. Nicole Carter and Joseph Hare are saying, that topic in itself warrants an entire series of discussions because it is so nuanced again, and it is so complicated, and so I would love to keep going down that route, but we should have another conversation about it. So the next question the next question actually sort of addresses what, the two of you were talking about, and what I brought up as well. And so this is for all panelists. And once again, I'll call you out, or call on you rather. I'm not going to call you out. I'll call on you. So based on this whole discussion that we've had so far today, and of course, these are sensitive topics. And again, so many layers, so many nuances, so many hidden things that we need to consider very carefully, very strategically, and very thoughtfully to make this equitable to those who are being affected by these things in society. But what are some immediate changes that we can make to the ways that we think and act as a society that are going to help improve our lives? In other words, here's where I'm coming from. For me, over the past, especially over the past decade, I mean, it was sort of brewing before that too, but especially over the past decade, it definitely feels like somewhere along the way, like we just derailed. And, as diversity, equity, and inclusion became bigger and bigger and bigger trendy buzzwords on Google, society actually became more divisive, divided, and hostile to each other, which, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, that's like mind blowing to me, because it's like the words are trending and we're going in the opposite direction with our actions. So what is going on there? And how do we bring our thoughts and actions back on track toward intentional inclusion? Let's start with you, Joseph.
Yeah, when you think about immediate, I always think about that has to start with yourself. Something that's going to change immediately is going to definitely anchor in yourself. That's the only real space that a person can immediately bring about change. And I know for a lot of what I've experienced, when I begin to self-actualize and I begin to really be honest in growing myself and exploring myself, I found that a lot of what it was that was impeding myself was myself. And so there are some attributes that we have that really ought not be a part of the social community that we're trying to connect with. We need to be willing to let go of some things in ourselves so that we can see that immediate effect in how it is that we're able to engage other people and how other people are able to engage us. Maybe there is something that I could do getting back to my face. Maybe I could shave the hair off my face, and as a plain face, maybe I could look less, confrontational. I don't know. But I could look for something first in me. So if I wanted immediate change, it has to begin with, let me take a look at my own self. Let's do some real self exploration and see if there's something in me that I can do to promote the opportunities and the access points and the comfort levels of other individuals.
Okay. Can you hear me? Ooh.
Yes, I hear you. I can hear you, AJ.
Yeah.
There's some background noise. I couldn't hear who you called on.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there for a second. In full disclosure, it is storming like crazy out here. So wow. I don't know what's going on, but sorry. I said thank you, Joseph, for that answer. And Priscilla, do you have thoughts on that? How do we go back get back on track towards intentional inclusion?
Yeah, I have to apologize. I wasn't sure if that was me because it's starting to storm here as well. So sorry about that. Yeah, much to going back to what Joseph said, I think that it is really coming back to ourselves and really looking at, I found that some people, a lot of people actually, I think, are maybe sometimes afraid to realize that there are some things internally that is holding them back from realizing, okay, this is what I need to do to move forward. Nobody wants to realize that they may have thoughts or feelings that, are holding them back from moving forward. And just for an example, my husband has a friend. We grew up in high school together. They have been best friends. And over the course of the last few months, everything in the country is very volatile right now. We had a gathering and he said, I have to apologize. For years, I didn't understand where you were coming from. I didn't see it because maybe in my mind, I didn't want to believe that it was true, that you were experiencing racism and inequality. And now I'm realizing it now. I'm seeing it. I'm hearing what you're saying. And I apologize for not doing that sooner. And so having, those thoughts and feelings inside, it really, nobody wants to, realize that they could be holding back from being fully intentional in accepting others based on, and it's sad to say, but sometimes it is how they grew up, how they were raised in their household, and not being exposed to people from other cultures or ethnicities or races. And that has been holding them back. But yeah, I did say through the course of the past few months to just in conversations with friends and family members, there are people that don't want to admit that maybe they do have underlying, racist tendencies or biases or stereotyping that, it's hard to come to that realization. So I think that sometimes when we look within ourselves and move past those things and admit that those things can be going on, then we can move forward and we can have the tougher conversations and engage in those conversations where, okay, here's how it's been, here's what I'm realizing, how do we move forward now? And let's have those tough conversations and let's make a change.
I agree. Kobena-Marcus, what about it?
Well said, everybody. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle on this, just because we've had a couple of people speak about the individual. And I'm going to take it because of the work that I do, working for a major corporation, and thinking about diversity and inclusion in the space that I specifically think about every day. To get us back on track, I think part of what is going to happen, and part of the challenge, I won't say specifically for my organization, but in general, I would say, is it can sometimes feel like the majority group is being attacked, and they have enjoyed certain amounts of luxuries, and it's natural to want to push back. I think that being said, though, it's going to take courageous conversations, and it's going to be take organizations to take that deeper look inside of the way that they move, the way that they operate, and ultimately, what I found is something that we can do in an immediate space from an organizational standpoint is focus on allyship and look at not a scenario where us versus them. It's we're all in this together. We're in this organization. We have to keep the lights on. We have to make sure the organization is successful, make sure that we continue to innovate and do all the things that we set out to do from an organization standpoint. But we're not monolithic. We're not just one solitary mind. We're not and if we might be able to fake it for a while if they silo, but as long as we start to come together and have conversations, there's going to be challenging conversations that are going to happen. We can't have those by ourselves and say it's us versus them. We have to, bring in allies in order to, one, get the communication across, because similar to what Priscilla just said, her husband's friend didn't get it. And it's going to take extra time and conversations. You think about the psychology of things, it takes 7 times for you to remember one thing or even be open sometimes to a new concept. So we have to immediately get out of our silos, have regular conversations so that at some point it can click. Because as a former teacher, sometimes I had to say the same concept 7 different times in different ways for it to make sense for that one person. And when we're talking organizations are, exponentially dynamic because we have people, and people are dynamic. And so in order for us to have organizations get back in line with the true essence of diversity and inclusion and equity and belongingness, we have to include everybody in the process, and everybody has to understand their space. As an ally, you can't remain silent, but you also don't necessarily need to be in the front of the movement. Being an ally is allowing people who don't have the privilege and the voice in the right spaces at the right times. That's what allyship is, to bring those people the opportunity to be at the table, or again, putting an extra, when you have those extra leaves on the table, we're just make the table bigger and make sure that everybody's at the table. Because we already have a table established. We don't want to blow it up. We put a lot of work into it. But let's make space so that the table can fit everybody at the table. We don't need to have the kids' table like in Thanksgiving, have the kids' table and the adults' table. We're all at the same table.
Well, is there a way I can make a point on that? Do we have time? Do we have time? If you don't mind, if you triggered something, I'd like to know. I've been at a lot of dinners. There are certain things that children like doing to be a child that wouldn't fit at a table with adults. So how do you allow a child to be a child and still have them and using your dinner table concept?
Right.
I'd like to know your thoughts on it. Children like to do certain things and they need to be comfortable. How do you, okay.
Yeah, great question. So it's not that, so sometimes you have the adults that have to sit at that children's table, right? Because there's not space, not because of the conversation, but because there's not space. And in my analogy, it's not that the kids are coming to the table, it's all of the people who are supposed to be at the table are at the table, as opposed to we just don't have space for you, so you have to sit at a lesser space, okay. Right? So it's not to say that, again, I like your example. Children conversation should stay there, but sometimes you have the adults because they're not, like, think about it from a generational standpoint. You have the young adult, but because the table has always been this big and it's always been this way, as the new young adult, which maybe our Gen Zers or our millennials, you still have to sit at the kids' table, even though you're ready for the table, but we're not making room for you. So instead of doing that, let's bring people who are ready, who have matured, who have the right amount of data, the right amount of introspection, and who are ready for the conversation. Let's make space for them, because now we can bring more to the table.
Awesome. All right. Thank you.
I appreciate the clarification.
That was a really good point, and it good clarification. Thank you for that. Dr. Nicole, your thoughts on how we bring our thoughts back on track toward intentional.
So I was just gonna say, I've been part of so many equity initiatives and all these different things, and they seem at first to be working, right? They seem to have everyone who should be there, that we think should be there, at the table, but then something falls apart at some point. And so I do believe the individual being intentional with ourselves is one step, right? Creating that table, that space, having folks at the table is another step, but also holding each other accountable for the change that we wish to happen is important. So it's having actionable steps, and then having this other person or these other people there that will say, well, remember you said you were going to do this thing, you were going to write this letter to the president, not the president, but of an organization or institution. Remember you said you were going to do this, so what are the steps that you're taking to do it? And then once that is done, how are we following up? Because often there's no follow through. We create all these different things and all these action items, and then we don't follow through. And so that is really the follow through and the individual change. So all those things are needed. The individual change, folks at the table, action steps, and accountability.
That's actually a really good concise way to put things, and just step by step. So thank you for that. And let's close this particular question out with Pascale. Pascale, what are your thoughts on bringing us back toward intentional inclusion, rather, not from?
I think Dr. Carter hit it on the nose with everything, how she summed it up. I really do believe it starts with you individually first, though, and then holding yourself accountable. Because I think sometimes, and I can just look at, myself personally, sometimes I am afforded the space to be transparent in certain rooms and settings, but because of the way I grew up, I hold myself back. And I'm thinking about a recent conversation I had, with my supervisor yesterday. after a year of getting to know him and building rapport, I was transparent about some things that I saw and practices that I saw within our section. And so I think for me, it really falls down to, holding myself accountable. And when those opportunities and those spaces come up for you to speak up about an issue, you take it and you run with it. But again, I think Dr. Nicole or Carter rounded out everything as far as how we can get to that space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah. And, when I think about this, I always think about, and if you've seen some of the other sessions over the summit, for me, it boils down to taking small steps, being consistent every day, day in and day out, realizing that this is not a moment, it's a movement, it's a lifelong movement, and there is no end to the learning that we have to go through in this movement. So for me personally, that's how I've been able to stay on my track toward intentional inclusion, especially with planning this summit and bringing together all of you and all of my other speakers, which I'm so thankful for. But we are running short on time, so 60 seconds for all of you, each 60 seconds. Final thoughts on everything that we've talked about today. And I'm just going to go in order of who I see here. So Joseph, let's start with you.
Well, real quick, I would encourage everyone to want to be included. Make sure that you're making it clear, I am here. I have special things that I bring. I have special needs that I have, but I want to make sure I'm here and I want to be included. And so let's be self-propelling in that environment so that when we're looking at the challenges of inclusiveness, it's not because we're expecting someone to dig around and try to find us, but to make sure that we're very easily found. And then when we're found, we make sure that our special offerings and our special needs are very clear up front.
Awesome. Pascale, final thoughts?
Yeah, take up space, and don't be afraid to take up space in the rooms and the settings that you're in, because you're there for a reason. And essentially, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. So yeah, in a nutshell, yeah.
Awesome. Absolutely. Kobena-Marcus, final thoughts?
Okay, so I think I'll go back to the concept of allyship. Allies can be anybody who has the privilege of being at the table. Make sure that we're advocates, sponsors, champions, scholars. Oftentimes we forget that because we're in a leadership role that we can't be a scholar of somebody else's experience and make ourselves better. And I would encourage all those who are paying attention to this today to champion somebody else and take pride in elevating others, because you become better as a result. So if you think selfishly, even selfishly, I know that's a concept that's in higher education. PhDs want to make other PhDs so that they can say that was one of mine. I think there's a noble effort in that, and I appreciate that. And I think we can take the best of that in all of our movement forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Nicole, final thoughts?
I would just say, again, see people for who they are, see people and all of their complexity, treat people the way they want to be treated, and believe folks when they tell you something is happening and they have a particular situation. And then, yes, what others have said, hold ourselves accountable, but also make sure to hold others accountable.
Absolutely. And Priscilla, final thoughts?
Yeah, really keeping yourself open to listening and learning and growing, and really see people beyond that outer shell of what you see. Allow them the opportunity to show you and tell you who they are, not so much what they are, who they are, and really accepting people for everything that they are, and who they are. So just like and having tough conversations when they need to be had, not holding back, and really just taking part in those conversations.
Absolutely. And so with that, thank you all so much. This was actually a true panel discussion because you actually followed up with each other and discussed things. And this is how panel discussions should be, instead of just the moderator spitting questions out. So I thank you for that tremendously. And I thank you to all of our viewers, whether you're watching live or later. If you have any other questions or comments, please make sure you put them in the comment box, because we will be moderating the comments even after the live. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Pascale. Thank you, Kobena-Marcus. Thank you, Dr. Nicole. And thank you, Priscilla. For our viewers, we are going to be seeing Pascale and Dr. Nicole later today in their solo presentations. And the other three have their solo presentations up already, so make sure you check them out. And on that note, we are going to end this session and hop off so that all of you can come join me in our next session, which starts in 4 minutes. So we will see you in there, and thank you all so much again. Bye.
Thank you.